FIU. They're going to be doing a presentation with our students, actually, so I think it'll be really interesting as we talk about them earlier in the presentation. Dr. Tiffany Troxler is the Director of Science at the Sea Level Solutions Center at FIU, which focuses on advancing knowledge, decision-making, and actions towards mitigating the causes and adapting to the effects of sea level rise. She is a research scientist with expertise in coastal and wetland ecosystem ecology. And we also have John Stewart. He's the Associate Dean for Cultural and Community Engagement in the FIU College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts, as well as Executive Director of the Miami Beach Urban Studios, and also the Director of the CREDA Innovation Lab for 3D printing. So let's all welcome them.
Thank you very much. Oh, you got it. Okay, perfect. This is going to be a little complex because we brought students here. Tiffany Troxler is here, and what we're going to do is give a brief outline, and then give it over to students in design and students in science. And we have projects that were architecturally based and projects that were landscape architecturally based. So we'll start with what we were trying to, what Tiffany and I were trying to do here. So these courses that we're reviewing were courses that happened last year in 2018. They were kind of explorations of data-driven analysis. So we're really looking at the intersections. Tiffany's the director, as was mentioned, of the FIU Sea Level Solutions Center. And we're really interested in how knowing more about the world we live in and knowing more about the situations that we're dealing with helps us to make better informed decisions. So that's where one of the many ways in which the science students and the scientific component of this has helped to address sea level rise. We're also looking, this data isn't just scientific data, it's also research about the people and the conditions that created the buildings and the urban fabric that we're looking at. We think with today's technologies, that there are a lot of, particularly our online our abilities to search online, we can find out new things, and we can realize that the historic fabrics that we're dealing with were always dynamic. They were always in change. I mean, I think Alan mentioned, even going back to the substrata that we're on, is the result of climate change, of drastic changes to land, water, land, water, land, water. And we're looking at innovations. We've been looking at innovations in design, and not only in design, but also in how we use data, how you finance some of these things. We've been asking students to ask themselves, like, okay, if this is your project, how do you pay for it? You're a student, you don't have any money, so what do you turn to make your building resilient? I mean, many of us as homeowners in Miami Beach ask the same question. And we're also interested in solution management. So we're very interested in how universities, like the University of Miami or FIU, or other universities deal with and can be part of this conversation. Because of the 15-year window that we have, 15 months, if only we had 15 years, students forever. Our metrics would be terrible, we never have graduates. But some of us are never really graduates. We're always students. So the idea is that we look at what you can see in 15 weeks, because in a professional setting, you take much longer than that to kind of figure out what the project is even, let alone to kind of come up with solutions. So how do we kind of manage these expectations and bring students into the conversation, but understanding what we're doing, and then exploring. We're also interested in exploring the analytical, anticipatory decision making. So we're looking at being anticipatory in our approaches to things and not just reactive. And I think this is also going back to something that Alan said. I'm going to just briefly whiz through the way we're going to divide this talk is I'm going to briefly go through what we did at the Urban Studios with the architecture students, and then have an architecture student, Dennis Ibarra, is going to present his one case study. So you can hear a student who's worked on this for 15 weeks, what he says. And then Tiffany's students, our science students, will talk about the landscape project that they did in North Beach, and how they worked with the landscape architects and the science that was involved with that. So that's the way this session is supposed to go. So first of all, one of the things that we did was we turned to the City of Miami Beach. Debbie Tackett was involved with this. We wanted students to realize that they're never alone when they get involved with a project, and they looked at the sheet Debbie provided, in many cases, the building cards. They looked at where architects were from before they came here, so the idea of architects working elsewhere, in this case Ontario. Our particular project explored one block on Michigan Avenue, from the 600 block, so from 6th Street to 7th Street. There were 15 buildings and 13 students, so 2 of the buildings did not get the love and attention that they deserve, but and the students drew them out of a hat. So there was no kind of angle that what they did. They learned things about buildings, they learned about the relationships, and this is something that was important. We used newspaper.com, which our university does not subscribe to, neither does the University of Miami or practically any other university in the country. It's about local newspapers. We used very local newspapers. We learned who got parking tickets, who married who. In this case, we looked at ads that contractors put in the paper, who was working with whom, so we could understand how the building community was itself a community. The builders, new builders, their daughters and sons married each other, they became builders, they worked on different blocks. And then Miami Beach's fabric of the districts is basically a series of threads of interwoven families who often even lived on the same block, watching the buildings going up, moved to another block, building, as Debbie likes to point out, almost identical buildings in other parts of the city to what we saw here. I mean, Gene Bayless was also very well known for his dancing, his dance studio, looking at how these architects were not just architects, although we may only view them that way, but they had lives that went, and the society that they helped build was far beyond what they actually came across. We, found that in this case, one of the owners and his family members were very involved, putting the first nail into Hitler's coffin. It happened on the 600 block, in case you didn't know it. And we were looking at the 601 to 611 community was actually one of the first ones to have a combination of people who rented and people who owned in the same building. It's a complex of 2 buildings that are identical. The students looked at the buildings as types, for their details, what it meant, what you want to preserve, to think about the types of fabric that we're dealing with. And we also used the 3D printing to understand the building, and so we kind of made a model of the building. We 3D printed a model of the building that we could use because we were interested in how we would communicate information about the project. So each student 3D printed their own building. That forced them to think about their model in the context. And the white was what the students had proposed to remain there. So you could see things, for example, buildings on top, additions on top of buildings behind, and a variety of different options that the students were looking at. Another thing we were able to see by exploring the block from the 600 block to the 700 block was there was, at one point in the future history of this block, it will be flooded. It will first flood from here more regularly up to here. But there was a slight raise even within this block. But we didn't realize that there was just that. You can't tell when you're there that part of the block is lower than the other. But there will be a difference between living on this end and this end. We also understood by looking at the history in more detail the different ambitions that Miami Beach has always had. And Ellen made a mention to this, but the very first buildings, as we'll see, Dennis had the room number 1, the very first building that was on the block. The ambitions were very high. Miami Beach was a luxury place to live, and then after the 30s, it was a place. It changed. The ambitions changed. The building fabric changed. And we even had on our block one of the very first condos. So we had one building, the last building built on the block was the first building built as a condo. And it was also the first building built with a Cuban owner and a Cuban builder and a Cuban architect. And so we saw the block change, and we believe that this is probably pretty typical of our entire city. One of the students, these were just looking at some of the solutions. One of the students proposed that the building float on top of this entire foundation be dug out and create a retention pond, and you enter at different heights depending on the height of the tides. We looked at buildings. We looked at, for example, Simberg had a major landmark high-rise in Brooklyn that still exists, and came down after that building was built and after the Depression, and started to build a new type of, and worked with Jacob Stein of the Shelbourne, the family that owned the Shelbourne, and created a kind of new type of suburban building that I don't think the city had realized was actually type, the Rambler type. It was identified in an early article, and this is also at 600, right down in the 600 block at the 6th Street. But you can kind of see the other ambitions of Miami Beach, that it be suburban somehow, that it somehow had this other type to it. So these were all kind of interesting to discuss. And then this building was one that we realized it was built as the most efficient, it was built to be efficient and rented as a catwalk building on that side. And in fact, it has almost never had any apartments available. Even today, it has almost no apartments available. It's one of the most efficient designs. The student proposed that instead of lifting it, that the canals would be. Many students proposed that canals become water retention areas for kayaking and other transportation modalities. And then, in this case, the first floor would become a WeWork or some other kind of more temporary office space, and the top floor would go here. So one of the questions was, okay, so we all live in this building, all of us in the studio. Who gets the top floor? How do we decide? I mean, our condo has enough difficulty, as I was telling Jack, enough difficulty just deciding which lights should hang in the lobby. How do you decide how you're going to reorganize the building? But all these are very interesting questions when you have modifications to it. So with that, I want to turn the presentation over to Dennis, and you just press this button to move forward, and he'll kind of take you through what he learned about doing this project.
Thank you so much for having me. As John Stewart mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be one of the students in the studio in which we explored the 600 Michigan Avenue. And we started by looking at the historical context and the history behind each one of the buildings that we were assigned to. I was assigned 642 Michigan Avenue, which is in fact the oldest building on the block. And it was actually the first building ever built on that section of Michigan Avenue. So as you can tell, it's located between 6th and 7th Street on Michigan Avenue. And the original owner was Paul Pollock. Paul Pollock was known as one of the original investors of Miami Beach. He was originally from Chicago, and he was part of what became known as the Gasoline Society. These were people who had made a lot of money in oil, and were looking at how to invest that money, how to create generational wealth, and they decided they had connections with Fisher and Collins and the Loomis brothers, and they ended up moving to Miami Beach to invest. And this was one of the first buildings they invested into. And they used one of the local architects, W.F. Brown, who was working with Fisher, Collins, and the Loomis brothers. And its construction started in 1925, and it was a very expensive building for its time. The original cost was $60,000, which was a tremendous amount of money, because when we looked at the historical records, most apartment buildings at the time were, the original construction cost was around $9,000 to $12,000. So they spared no expense into building and designing this building. They had a great ambition. They wanted to create their own version of Riviera. Because if you take into consideration, these people were doing money, so they could not fit in with the wealthy aristocratic families that would vacation in the Rivieras in Europe. So they wanted to create their own version of that in Miami Beach, which offer the perfect climate for it. Paul Pollack was very involved with the community. He was one of the founding members of the Miami Beach House Association. And he developed they've had several projects in Miami Beach. W.F. Brown was a very prolific architect, and he worked mostly with the big developers and servicing their clientele. So Colin Fisher will sell wealthy people the lots, and W.F. Brown will design it. Actually, he designed casinos, hotels, buildings that are currently existing on Espanola Way, and there are several construction buildings that are still standing in Miami Beach. When this building was built, it was during the period of a big building boom in Miami Beach. Just in 1 month alone, in September, over $2 million were approved for construction in Miami Beach. And in 1 month alone, in 1927, over $150,000 worth of apartments opened in Miami Beach. I'll just skip over that. This building is a contributing building. It was done, like I mentioned before, in the Mediterranean revival style, and it has all the characteristics of the Mediterranean revival. It has a lot of ornamentation, and it is in an impressive state of preservation. No renovations have been done. The facade hasn't been altered, and even has the original wood balcony from 1925, which, considering how many hurricanes we've had and termites, is pretty impressive. This building survived the Depression. It was actually one of the first buildings that was sold during the Depression, and we see that there's a much faster recovery in Miami Beach versus the rest of the nation throughout the Depression. Debbie provided us with historical documentation for the building. Unfortunately, the plans for this building were not very legible, so we had to go by photographic evidence and by visiting the site to recreate the plans and architectural drawings for the building. Very important characteristic this building has, and it's the only building on the site that actually has a basement. So, and we looked at the floor plans for the building. It has 2 one-bedrooms, it has studios, and it has the one-bedroom apartments. They kept what they call the main group in the middle to service the people who will come and rent the units here. Remember, these were originally meant to be vacation rentals. Some people live there year-round, but most people that came to Miami Beach will come for the season. And then we started looking at the projections and the future of the building with regards to sea level rise. And this building sits at about 3 feet NADB. And if we look at the projections for 2100 and the conservative projections, I might add, king tide is going to be about 8 feet NADB. That means that in order to preserve the building, we need to raise it roughly about 5 feet. So the solution that we explored 3 different solutions with John Stewart. One was to maintain the facade of the building, raise it to 9 feet, and build an addition in the back. Second one was to build a rooftop addition. And the third one was to retain the majority of the facade and some of the original building and build an addition in the back. We have to take into consideration that the current code as it stands prevents us from doing any of this or implementing any of these 3 options. So we understand that the Flamingo Park historic overlay was put in place to protect this building, but when the code was written, they weren't considering the threats of sea level rise. So we did propose certain changes to the code in order to make this happen. So we actually ended up going with option number 2, in which we built a modernist addition to the original structure. We elevated the building at roughly 5 feet. And we financed this by raising the building by building the addition on top and using it as vacation rentals. Because if we go by the historical context of the building, this building was meant to be vacation rentals, short-term rentals. So that was another thing that needs to be updated in the code. This is the section through the building with the addition in which we reinforced the original structure, raised the building, and added a water absorbent membrane in the basement as well. These are the typical floor plans of the addition, and we did preserve the original layout of the building as to disturb the building as little as possible. And we have we have in each floor 1 2-bedroom unit, 2 studios, and 2 1-bedroom units in the back. So this shows the circulation of the building. And another thing that we proposed was using dredging the alleys to fill the sides, because everybody in the class basically needed to raise the building. So as a class, we decided to go with that strategy. And this is a rendering of what the future 642 Michigan Avenue will look like once the addition is built. This is another view in which we extended upon in the front so we could see the change of the tides. And this is the alleyway, which will become a blue waterway for the city of Miami Beach.
Thank you. The only other thing, I was only going to add, the other cool thing that he discovered was that there was a school in that building. It was like an elementary, just like a daycare elementary school, meaning that the community itself wasn't only residential, even when it was first built, that it had other usage right on that block. So, thank you. Handing it over.
Thank you, John. So thanks so much for the opportunity to present today. So this is, I think this is the third Sea Level Solution Center interdisciplinary research and design studio that we've done. I think it's the third. Yeah, so the idea is that because John and I have such a wonderful partnership, we've had the opportunity to work across disciplines. So architects working with engineers, with ecologists, with policy experts, with natural resource economics experts, computer science experts, to try to develop more comprehensive ideas about how we can build resilient designs that take all the different sectors that are potentially will be affected by sea level rise into consideration. And so this year, our students have worked very hard, like worked well beyond the semester to try to pull this together into a product. And in fact, have included a computer science student who's going to present a little tool that they've been working on for some time. So we're going to have a multimedia presentation. So do you guys want to start? And then we can do the tool after? Yeah, okay, so we'll well, I think their presentation is on first, right? Yeah. So we'll do this and then switch over. Yeah. So who gets the microphone first? So we've got Ron and Aurora, Helen, Tim, and Maria and Jasmine. So they're in Department of Earth and Environment. Aurora's finished in landscape architecture. Maria is in the computer sciences department. And Helen, you're in public administration. Yeah. All right, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron, and I have my bachelor's in environmental engineering. I'm studying my master's in geosciences, so I'm with the Earth and Environment department.
Can you talk more directly to the mic, please?
Okay.
Thank
Can you guys hear me now?
Much better.
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay,
Can
fine.
you stand over here?
Okay, I'll be over
There's
here.
some kind of feedback on that side.
Actually, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you told me right. I heard myself. Okay. So I'm Ron Shad. I'm a master's student in geosciences with the Earth and Environment Department. So again, with E&E, and I have my bachelor's in environmental engineering, so I was the engineering on staff. But last spring, we were all in class for landscape architecture where we worked interdisciplinary to develop solutions for resiliency. And not gonna lie, I loved the class, and that's why I still work to this day to develop solutions. And so the name of this presentation is Sustainable Adaptations for Sea Level Rise. And just here's a few pictures of the teams we had in the class, and I believe we had 3 teams, all with one person from an interdisciplinary background. Yeah. So here's just an outline of the presentation. So we first start with the background, and first we start with the 100 Resilient Cities framework, which drives the quantitative part of our work. Then we go into the site location specifically for the class with the baseline study we did, and then the project summaries that were results of that class. Then we jump into the 4 dimensions of the framework that drive the quantitative analysis, the phasing process, and the project examples. Then finally we have a short calculation example of the quantitative side of things. And we're not going to scare you with too much math. It's an easier calculation. And then the tool that we were developing from our computer scientists. So, how many of you have heard of the 100 Resilient Cities? Okay, right, that's Miami Beach, so most of you should know it. So, 100 Resilient Cities is a nonprofit founded by the Rockefeller Foundation, but they came out with a framework for resilient cities to drive resilient ideas and goals. And there's 4 dimensions: healthy well-being, leadership and strategy, economy, society, and infrastructure and environment. And each dimension has 3 goals. So in total, there's 12 goals. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just simple examples where it meets basic needs, enhances and provides protected natural and man-made assets, or empowers a broad range of stakeholders. The reason I mention those is because it's easy to say we'll meet those goals, but to quantify them is a big problem. And that's why we have an interdisciplinary team, because most of the things I couldn't answer on my own, because I'm an engineer, so I was never concrete. So now the site location I was picked for the class is the North Shore part of Miami Beach. So it's about 8.6 million square feet or 0.3 square miles. And there's a lot going on this site, and that's what made it interesting, but also challenging, coming from my background. So as you can see here, there's recreational spaces that the community uses for after-school care. I believe there's a building here that's actually after-school care. Then you have water tanks used for water storage. I believe there's businesses, residential, and also it is Miami Beach, so you still have tourists coming and going, and also you have water coming in because it's very susceptible to king tides. So that's why there's a great site. And also, I know historically, there's a band shell. And I know specifically for the architect, I know they want to mention this, it's historically recognized by the National Historic Landmark Preservation because of the touch of Mayan martyrdom, Mediterranean revival, and Art Deco. So I didn't know that, I learned that in history. So not only is it historically significant, but also it is susceptible to sea level rise. So these are projections provided by NOAA, and our class focused on the footage of sea level rise, not by the dates. So as you can see, by 4 feet, most of the site is innovative, right? So that means a loss of critical infrastructure. That means a loss of community spaces, and the social fabric will be disintegrated, right? Because of all the flooding. And so by 6 feet, and it's a little bit worse, but it's still mostly innovative. So that made our class wonder, how do we create these lines of resilience for the future? And before we did that, we did a comprehensive baseline study to understand all 4 sectors of the site. So I know there's a lot going on here, and I'm not going to kill you guys again with the map, but we looked at all sectors. So we looked at circulation patterns, we looked at housing costs, we looked at income coming into families, we looked at we looked at the impervious land cover. And just to give you a few numbers, the impervious cover is 70%, which is very resilient. 95% of the people on site were employed, but 20% of the site was living in poverty. And also, per household, it was about 18 tons of carbon dioxide released per year. So there's a lot of there's a lot of problems on the site for resiliency. So that question, how do we have all 4 sectors and come up with solutions for those? And that's where I hand off to Pam, and she's going to talk about the actual designs.
Thank you, Ron. Like Ron mentioned, my name is Helen. I'm a public administration student and focusing on community development. So I'm going to focus on the framework elements that Ron mentioned as it relates to our design. So we developed 3 major projects to find solutions for sea level rise in Miami Beach. And these are 3 different stills of the 3 different projects. What the projects have in common is that we increase wetland areas, we address policy solutions that could improve the area as it transforms into an area that has sea level rise. But most importantly, we embrace the water. So that was the mentality going into these projects, that water is going to come. And as opposed to just retrofitting buildings, how can we have amphibious buildings that can coexist with the water that comes? So one of the frameworks that Ron mentioned is health and well-being. So we envisioned an area in Miami Beach where the city can produce its own food and have some independence from the mainland area. So that's a depiction that you see here in the image. This dimension relates to how important it is for the government to take care of the basic needs of the community. And as we think of sea level rise and how it affects the livelihoods of people, we need to take food into consideration. So that's one of the design elements that we were looking at. For economy and society, we envisioned a few different areas, a few different models for what housing could look like. So in this example, we considered a mangrove community home system. It would be a sustainable system using containers. And there's different versions of this, some that are a little bit more luxurious. But ultimately, the idea is that it's amphibious and it would coexist with the water as it rises. This is another way of how we envision the housing to look like. Technology and infrastructure is highly critical for the Miami Beach area as it relates to sea level rise. These roads are going to be inundated with water. It's important to have alternative solutions for how people can get around. Currently, there isn't like a metro line that comes over here from the mainland area, so that's something that we wanted to address with having a rail that's connected to the mainland. We also have water taxis and the street monorail, which you can see in the top right. And lastly, I'm going to discuss leadership and strategy. One of the things that we were looking at is community feedback. And one of the things that community members said is that they want more public areas, more green spaces. So that's something that we tried to put into our projects, making sure that there were flexible public spaces that you can walk from building to building. You don't necessarily use water taxis or other means to get around. And I'm going to pass it now to Jasmine, who's going to discuss, to Aurora, who's going to discuss the phases of our project.
Hey everyone, my name is Aurora, and I'm a landscape architecture student graduate. I graduated last year. So the implementation of our ideas would be rolled out in a multi-phase approach. Each phase would be responding to the level of water rising within the site. So on our first phase, we envisioned to create awareness between the community. And in a way, so we started implementing bioswales in the house where the medians currently exist, so we can turn those into bioswales and start cleaning the water, having water on site so people can start getting used to having water. Also a floating home pilot program, so then we start implementing some housing on this side where housing already exists, so that people start seeing these floating homes. And we also have those towers that you showed at the beginning where they're growing food and all that. So start implementing small, but begin. Then we have the second phase, which is more of a transformation. So here the water would go from east to west. What was the map that we saw before, we saw all these tennis courts and all this public space. So this is public-owned land. And what we envision, if we can keep the sports, we can elevate them, we can make them into floating platforms, but still have the water come in and go from side to side, and that can be used for fisheries, right? Like, the different phasing of fish, wildlife, and more mangroves, and more integration within with water. We also start seeing mounds. So if there's what do we call it? Shelters in place. So if there's an emergency or whatever, people can still stay there and go have it. And lastly, we start implementing a pier system, which could be additional public spaces for entertainment or studies or that sort of thing. And ultimately, by phase 3, we accept the water, right? So this is way in the future, obviously. This is not tomorrow, but eventually we begin connecting all these buildings through bridges. We start seeing new ways of living. Miami is not going to be in the future the Miami that it is now. So we need to start envisioning this new way of living and new technologies coming in. So we have engineering, we have computer sciences, and new fields that are going to emerge because of this change, right? So we're looking into the future and transformation. Now to Jasmine.
Hi everybody, my name is Jasmine, and I'm also trying to speak into the mic. So I was also on the design team as a earth and environment scientist with Aurora and on this design. And I just wanted to point out also to try to understand a little bit of what you're looking at, some of like our main strategies. So just highlighting the fact that we're emphasizing self-sufficiency, which kind of goes into this whole health and well-being element where we're creating our own food, where we're producing our own energy through solar panels on every rooftop we can find, and where we're collecting our own water as well within the water tanks that exist right now, that we're also envisioning can be retrofitted into these like vertical towers, which I'm personally kind of passionate about. My emphasis in the Earth and Environment Department is in agriculture, so I'm really interested in food and organic food and being self-sufficient. Another strategy is just restoring our ecosystem, so really planting out as many macros as we can. That's what this pier system also serves as in the ocean, which becomes more of a barrier. And how do you quantify that? So we have indicators for every single one of these questions, which actually ends up being about an estimate about 25 indicators. And to just go into a little more detail on the first section of health and well-being, we have about 7 indicators there. So under the first question, how are essential resources for a person's basic physiological needs provided? We're looking at the percent water supplied, basically the amount we can actually store, like through rainwater, for example, versus how much we're going to need based on how many people are living here. A similar look at food security, how much are we growing versus how many people we have to feed. And energy balance. So we could also, like with biofuels or with solar panels, how much energy can we produce versus how much energy do we need? And then we go into more details on our livelihood opportunities available. Tim will go into some of those specifics on what those indicators mean on an economic level. How are we, because we know that all of sea level rise is going to impact us in our economy across the board in every way you look at it. So how can we measure what a design is planning for our economy? And lastly, what is the water quality? That is a pretty straightforward, basically looking at our impervious land cover and understanding what that will look like based on the quality of water. So kind of like what Aurora had asked earlier, are the chemicals in these buildings going to be, what ends up happening to the water that's coming in, and then how are we dealing with that based on how many wetlands we've incorporated into our design? and what that can clean up. So I'll pass it to Tim.
Hi, my name is Tim, and I'm a PhD student with Earth and Environment, and I focus on natural resource science, natural resource economics. So just looking at one of the questions, which is focusing on livelihood opportunities and support available, one of the things that we would do is we try to include making a comprehensive economic impact study that focuses on the direct as well as indirect impacts. We particularly focus to sort of like highlight elements of economic activity. So one of the elements that focuses that you can study about generating economic activity is potential increases in consumer expenditures. Because consumer expenditures and consumer spending is the driving force in the economy, it is very important to try to see if we're supporting livelihoods, if we're trying to increase incomes, like how do these designs sort of incorporate that? And in terms of resiliency, increased resiliency means that harnessing this potential spending power by providing goods and services locally. So if goods and services are continuously provided locally, and in an event of an upset, these goods and services can continue to be provided, which leads us to the second point, is when you're looking at goods and services, what sort of buildings do you have, or what sort of services do you offer? And that can go into looking at potential increase in sort of retail sales. And it sort of informs sort of the consumer spending aspect of it. Because once you have like increased services that you're building out, you have an increased tax revenue base, and that means that you have the increased ability to provide emergency services and resiliency services. And lastly, mixed-use zoning has been known to be sort of a hedging strategy, not only for investors, but also for homeowners as well. Because it is much more flexible, it is much less volatile to sort of like the ups and downs of the real estate market, and because homeownership is the single most driving force for household building and wealth, you want to provide just sort of livelihood opportunities and sort of to support rising incomes, to generate incomes, and increase household incomes. So, just looking at like what we did when we calculated the resiliency framework, we started to look at inputs. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but when we generated, like to try to come up with the resiliency framework, we tried to know what sort of inputs do we need, or what sort of information that any sort of urban planner, any sort of city official can use in order to see what sort of in their projects, like how resilient it can be. So it can go from residential zoning and how much the percent increase in mixed-use zoning of their resilience projects incorporate. Right? And I'm not going to go into detail, but this is within our resiliency framework. You have all of these sort of calculations in the background. Based on the inputs that you input into our framework, this is all the based on like data and literature, just generating like what would be sort of like the best measurement in this case of percent increase in consumer expenditures. And so what we did in terms of after you calculate that, it generates a sort of output based on this particular calculation. What we did is we basically on a weighted scale from a 0 to 5 for resiliency, based on like the percent increase, for example, in consumer expenditures. What would that scale, what would that number be based on how you design the particular, for that particular project? And based on the design that we did before, that Aurora and Jasmine talked about, in each of the design phases, what we've seen is that just based on just increasing consumer expenditures, based on how the design or how the project was designed, that the resiliency scores end up increasing over the design period. So throughout the phases, what we see is sort of like an increase in resiliency, especially as it relates to the percent increase in consumer expenditures. Back to Jasmine.
Okay, so after doing all these types of calculations from everything you're putting in, we come up with final scores. We rate all those indicators on a 1 through 5. And the goal is by the time we're done with this, which is where we're going to next, we'll be able to have a quick visual. This is kind of an estimate right now of how we would rate our design at the moment, between a 1 through 5 with the final score. So I will pass it to Maria, our computer scientist, who is actually putting this into a friendly user base for anyone to hopefully be able to use.
So, hi, my name is Maria. I'm a third-year PhD in computer science, and I collaborated with the team into making this the framework and the research about to make it into a web-based tool that anyone, basically any user, can go into it, and according to their own design, they can and the inputs that they're looking for, they can create the resilience score just as Tim presented before. So here we see that the tool is basically divided into the sectors that we already mentioned before. We have the health and well-being, which is the one that we are focusing mostly today. And for this one, we have basically some input parameters and some constants. The user, for each of the questions and indicators that they presented today, the user will give it an input. And we have the option to change the constants, but these constants, they were created basically through literature, and they are very application-based. So if we ask for the user to be careful when changing these values, but we still want to give them the possibility to do it, right? So if the user were they didn't know about some of the inputs, for each of them we will have like a brief description of what they do, something like this. More of the where the input is coming from, what does it mean, and what kind of literature is reference. So once the user fills up this form with all the values and they hit submit, they will get this rubric showing all the information as they presented before, how they are calculated. And for example, we can change here the equation output for basically these are all of the values that you need to know for each of the phases. Then what is the weighted score, and at the end we have the resilience score. And that's basically it. Any questions?
Well, if there are any questions, one of the things I'll just observe is that it's so interesting to see the importance of having many, many different inputs into this question of how we deal with resiliency in a historic environment. Because, I mean, we hadn't as a group spoken about retail yet, and the importance of sales, continued retail sales, the importance of retail on Lincoln Road, for example. We're going to have a Lincoln Road discussion very soon. And tomorrow there's the, May 15th is the Colony Theater, but tomorrow is the tour. But still, that's a huge part of what Miami Beach is. And so finding a way that this becomes that we approach the real world with all the complexity of the real world as we try to assemble and think about its future, I think is so interesting. It's also daunting. You know, as I'm trying to desperately figure out what these algorithms are doing in this thing, the energy balance of site is 2,936,558. I don't even know if I probably started wrong. Whatever it is, it's like to begin to conceptualize that seems so difficult. So, but anyway, I really appreciate all the work you guys did. because the design part is also a very different kind of modality in terms of thinking about it, and the city has to deal with both. I mean, the city deals with all of this stuff. Any questions for anybody, or yeah?
I have a question. So it seems like you guys took a lot, and I said it's really down to detail. But as you know, hormone changes, like sea level rise will go up, and also the climate changes. We also have to take the fact that also swarms and different categories do also change at time. So did you guys at any time see console from that, from my perspective? Okay, like how would it be like a regular hurricane compared? Would it be resistant to your design? Would you guys ever take research and analysis in that part?
We definitely did. So all of the buildings that we were conceptualizing withstand a Category 5 hurricane. The homes specifically, the way that they work as floating homes, as the tide comes up, they're supposed to move up so that there's less of a disturbance on the property, so that it would be more resilient towards storms and rising waters.
One of the other things that I was going to mention that made me think about is that we don't really take, in our modeling, we don't really take into account all the things that are happening in the rest of the country that's worse than what's happening here, and how we're going to deal with potentially an influx of people. We always think about Miami and the sea level rise being something that's going to export people, but in fact it may import people as the air quality becomes reduced in the west, or as the tornadoes become increasingly prominent in the southeast, or so the factors are so complex and so interesting that I think that the way you talked about food and the importance of food, we hadn't really talked about growing our own food. This is something that's happening here more and more. For example, the largest salmon producing factory in the country is being put here precisely because we have this condition of fresh water over salt water, and they need salmon, as you know, need salt water at certain times of their life and fresh water at certain times of their life. And we were the only place on the planet that can do that, and as we continue to have those special conditions, we may be more specially adapted. And as we have the conditions in the sky that we have today and almost every other day, we will continue to have optimal food producing possibilities, with the seaweed included and all the other things. So I thought your presentation was really, it was hard to give, hard to hear, because it was so complex, but it was super interesting. Thank you. And Dennis, sorry, I didn't mean to have it back to you, but you had really great suggestions with your building too, which has the basement and all that weird interesting stuff.